Discernment Part 1. Ignatius says that these rules are suitable for someone in the first week of the spiritual exercises. And as you know, during the first week, we reflect on our lives, draw closer to God, and try to orient our lives to the praise and service of God. And this can be a powerful experience. So discernment of spirits that are moving us in that first week can be very valuable. So what are we talking about? Well, discernment of spirits. We're trying to discern whether we are being guided by the good spirit or the evil spirit. And I think of an image of a sailboat. We might consider ourselves sailboats. And the good spirit or the Holy Spirit is the wind. We set the sails and let the good spirit move us along. With the wind at our backs, we're confident even in the face of difficulties. And that image of spirit as wind, of course, is found in the account of Pentecost Sunday. The Holy Spirit sounded like a strong driving wind as it filled the hearts of the disciples, and it propelled them out into the streets with wisdom and courage. So part of discernment of spirits is trying to notice that God's movement in our life like that. And we could probably think of examples of the good spirit moving in someone's life. There's good spirit moving in someone's life. I think of a Jesuit at a dinner table with members of the community. Community has 10 members, and that night there are 7 at the dinner table. And while he's enjoying dinner, the Jesuit has an experience of peace and gratitude and a feeling of fondness for the guys at the table. We could say that the good spirit is blowing in his life. Building on that image of a sailboat, the evil spirit might be considered the current in the water. The current is moving in a different direction than the wind. And if we've not set our sails, we might drift along with the current. And I think of another Jesuit at the same dinner table with members of the same community. And he's annoyed by the loud guy who is dominating the conversation. He's keeping quiet because no one's really interested in what he has to say anyway. The evil spirit is the current in the water, carrying his sailboat off course. Discernment is trying to figure out, are we being guided by the good spirit or the evil spirit? Allow me to make a brief digression and say a word about terminology and concepts. As I was putting some thoughts together, my accountant brain kept asking questions to try to understand things better. For me, it helps to bring things down to earth so that they get less theoretical. And my first question was about terminology. I think spirit talk is not always helpful to people. They might recognize a spiritual dimension to their lives, but they might not attribute actions to spiritual beings apart from God that are leading and guiding them. And that's okay. The truth is, our descriptions of God and heaven and spiritual realities are always incomplete and inadequate. So we don't have to use the words good spirit and evil spirit to talk about this experience. We might find it more helpful to talk about movement toward God or movement away from God. Mark Thibodeau talks about good space and bad space. And I think that works too. We would say that one Jesuit at the dinner table is in good space and that the other is in bad space. Consolation is the word that Ignatius uses to describe the movement toward God. And desolation is the word that Ignatius uses to describe the movement away from God. We could say that movement toward God is prompted by the good spirit, or alternatively, we could say that that movement is prompted by God, God working and moving and acting in our lives. Other things might also prompt that movement toward God. Someone shows us a particular kindness, or we hear a beautiful piece of music and we experience consolation. Our own virtues like patience or generosity might also draw us closer to God. Something may have prompted the Jesuit at the dinner table to experience consolation that night. Maybe someone said a kind word at the social before dinner. Or maybe the Jesuits at the table have formed connection over the months and years they've spent together. And that laid the groundwork for an experience of consolation that night. Maybe that particular Jesuit has become more patient, so little things don't bother him so much anymore. And that provides an opportunity for an experience of consolation. I think in the same way, we might say that movement away from God is prompted by the evil spirit. Alternatively, we can say that that movement is prompted by human nature or by greed or envy or resentment, something drawing us away from God. And sometimes circumstances beyond our control might also lead to an experience of desolation. In these days, I can't help but think of how the pandemic has put many of us in a bad space, at least for a time. It's not that we have all been in desolation for the past year, and certainly the pandemic has affected us in different ways, but I suspect all of us have been affected by it somewhat. Of necessity, we've all become more isolated. We can't have dinner with friends. We can't visit with family in person. So we're more isolated, and we're understandably worried about ourselves and our loved ones. The threat of sickness and death hangs over us. And then there's sadness. People have lost their jobs, have been cut off from family. Some people have died. It's a sad time. And if some of us have experienced more than our share of desolation in this past year, it's not surprising. I think experiences beyond our control can draw us away from God and feel more isolated. So we could talk about the good spirit and the evil spirit in other ways. Even so, sometimes it's helpful to personify these movements of the spirits. Sometimes it is as if there was someone out there who wanted to lead us away from God and had some very effective strategies for doing it. It can be helpful to talk about what the Spirit is up to in our lives or the lives of someone else. Another question I had, does the movement toward God or away from God influence everything we do? I don't think so. I would be stretching it to say that my lunch choice was prompted by the movement of the good or evil spirit. And much of what I do is probably only remotely affected by the movement of spirits. At the same time, movements within our spiritual lives probably impact us more than we realize. A third question, do we need to be attentive and deliberate in moving toward God? I ask this because I know a lot of people who are not very attentive to God or to spiritual matters, and yet are good people who seem to be moving in the right direction. I'd suggest that such people at least need an openness to God's Spirit moving in their lives. They would need to raise their sails at least a little bit to catch the wind. It seems that certain practices help us set our sails. Prayer is certainly one of those practices. Through prayer, we draw closer to God, become more attuned to God's action in our lives. But other practices can help set our sails too. Sometimes we just take a little time for quiet. That can help. Or good health can help us. Or connection with other people or generosity can move us closer to God. And some people do these things quite naturally, even if they're not particularly spiritual. I think kind, generous people can have an openness to God, even if they're not aware of it, or even if they wouldn't describe it in that way. So no, I don't think we need to be attentive or deliberate to be moving toward God, but I think those things certainly help. Okay, enough of my questions and digressions. Let's talk about an example of discernment of spirits. Suppose that you're a prayer companion for Jack. And here's a picture of Jack with his daughter many years ago in happier times. And Jack now reports that his daughter has grown up and living in California and has cut off contact with the family. And Jack feels guilty for not having had a better relationship with his daughter. Is the good spirit or the evil spirit prompting that guilt? Maybe it is the good spirit. Maybe Jack is moving closer to God through this experience. After a few questions, you discover that Jack has two children and was not very attentive to either one of them as they grew up. And he was more focused on his job, and his daughter came to resent that. But Jack has some reason to feel guilty. The good spirit might be prompting him to a change of heart. Jack's concern for his daughter and his desire for connection in his life has prompted him to take an honest look at his life. And that has resulted in an experience of guilt. Alternatively, it might be that the evil spirit is causing Jack to feel guilty. Jack's situation might be quite different than the one just described. Instead, you learn that Jack was a good father and attentive to his family. His daughter is 27 years old and has been living with Jack and his wife. She dropped out of college and never held a job for more than a few months. Jack and his wife recently told their daughter that she needed to find her own place and to become more responsible. Their daughter moved to California and cut off contact. And Jack is feeling guilty. Well, it seems that the evil spirit might be at work here. The evil spirit is drawing Jack in on himself and away from his wife and away from God, and making Jack discouraged. The fact that Jack is feeling guilty in itself doesn't tell us whether Jack is moving toward God or away from God. We need to discern the spirits. Ignatius says that the good spirit might be at work in the life of a person who is far away from God. In that case, God might bestow a sting of guilty conscience. And that's a good thing. That could provide God an opportunity to draw closer to that person. On the other hand, the good spirit would likely be affirming to a person who is close to God. And the evil spirit would likely be discouraging to such a person. That evil spirit is trying to throw that person off course. Ignatius says that for a person who is close to God, the evil spirit often attempts to harass and discourage, and often uses fallacious reasoning to do so. And I think that's a very accurate description. I suspect that many of us are familiar with that type of movement in our own lives or in the lives of people we know. That harassment and discouragement. So Ignatius points to a few strategies of the evil spirit that are good to notice. Ignatius suggests that if the evil spirit detects a lack of resolve, it will become fiercer. If it meets with strong resistance, it will back down. But if it detects fear or lack of trust in God or lack of resolve, it becomes fiercer. Another way of saying that is movement away from God can gain momentum. I think of gospel stories when Jesus confronted evil spirits and those who were possessed. The evil spirits wanted to control the situation and control the conversation, and Jesus didn't let that happen. Jesus took the bull by the horns and told the evil spirits to be quiet and drove them away. And I think the same thing can happen with the evil spirits in our own lives. My most memorable experience of desolation was when I was teaching at Boston College. Mostly I enjoyed Boston College. It was a great place, but I did have an experience of desolation. As a faculty member at BC, academic research and publishing were expected. And I was never very good at research. That was not my strong suit. And I was never able to get anything published, and that was very frustrating. The evil spirit did a lot of talking to me in those days. The evil spirit would say, "What have you been doing for 5 years? You are an embarrassment." And for several years, that was an ongoing topic in my prayer. I would end up reviewing the history or replaying the failures, and rehearsing my own defense. And I was getting nowhere. I was only feeling more discouraged, worthless, and isolated. So one day I said, enough. It was time to move on. And when the evil spirit tried to bring up that topic again, I'd say, go away. I'm not thinking about this anymore. You don't want to show a sign of weakness with the evil spirit. You have to be very firm. A second strategy is that the evil spirit encourages secrecy. The evil spirit wants us to keep desolation to ourselves. Our natural inclination is to keep things secret. Maybe we feel guilt or embarrassment, especially if we bear some responsibility for what's happened. And even if we don't feel guilty, usually desolation touches on a sensitive matter and exposes a weakness or vulnerability. Jack, in the previous example, doesn't want to talk about his problems with his daughter and his feelings of guilt. And I don't want to talk about my problems with research. The evil spirit loves to keep things secret. It gives desolation more power. If we name the problem or talk to others about it, the evil spirit loses some of its power. I have often had that experience when I've accompanied others in spiritual direction, and perhaps you have as well. Once someone starts talking about an experience of desolation, it becomes pretty clear that that's not from the good spirit. It's not a movement toward God. And I usually don't need to provide any insightful diagnosis. The person I'm accompanying figures it out before I can say anything. And a final strategy is the evil spirit will attack us at our weakest point. The evil spirit is very clever. If we're prone to anger and resentment, the evil spirit will attack us there. If we struggle to maintain a positive self-image, the evil spirit knows that and will make use of that. And if we have difficulty trusting God, the evil spirit will try to get us discouraged. Consolation doesn't always mean happy, and desolation doesn't always mean sad. But signs of consolation are hope and peace and connection with others and with God. And signs of desolation are discouragement, feeling distant from God, apathy or restlessness or sadness, low self-esteem. So we can kind of detect whether it's consolation or desolation by the mood we're in. But it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes we might be moving toward God and feel sad when a loved one is sick, or discouraged when our efforts meet with failure, or angry when an injustice has been done. So that's why we need to discern the spirits. Ignatius offers some suggestions on what to do when we're in desolation. And he recommends we not make major decisions and we don't change previous decisions. And Ignatius was really adamant about this, and it makes sense. We don't want to be, make a career decision when we're not in good space. Ignatius also recommended that someone in desolation be more attentive to prayer as a way of responding to that desolation, and to continue to trust in God, even in the midst of the darkness and the difficulty of desolation. I think we could probably add a few more suggestions. I think being more attentive to connections and to generosity can help. We might try connecting with others, even when we feel like staying in our room. I think connections can help. And we can find small ways to be generous as ways of sort of drawing us out from ourselves and beyond this experience of desolation. I think in the midst of all this, patience with ourselves and patience with others is important, because it's a difficult time. And I always recommend going to bed early. We don't want to stay in bed all day, but after a long day and we find ourselves in bad space, staying up later isn't going to fix anything. So it's probably best just to go to bed and try again tomorrow. Um, and Ignatius also has some suggestions of what to do when we're in consolation. Uh, Soak it in, appreciate it. Store up the grace and the strength for future desolation. Realize that, that consolation doesn't last forever, and that we ought to appreciate it, soak it in for the times that'll be more difficult. And Ignatius also recommends being humble. Don't start taking credit all for ourselves for that consolation, because most often we didn't have much to do with it. It's God's Spirit working in our lives, and we just appreciate it and are grateful for it.